Okay guys, so I've done this before in the past, but this is going to be another engine assembly video. This is the engine that I am have been building over the last few months, and am going to be trying to put this together today. This engine has been, for the most part, sourced with most of the parts that are some of the highest quality parts that I could find. You know, balance crank, the Bullfrog Racing piston rod with the big cap in the back. I'll take you through the torque specs of that rod. It's different from the ARC rod. You know, we have the Junior Dragster, lightweight, small, billet flywheel. You know, we have the piston, and everything has been micro polished. We have the piston pin, clips, camshaft. We have all the rods, the lifters. We have crankshaft shims. We have arbor shaft shims, which I use to shim my camshaft with. We have our head gaskets ready, and we're pretty much ready to move forward with the build. We also have our piston rings all laid out. Everything is, at this point, should be laid out in front of you, ready to move forward. In this situation, I'm using a total seal top ring. I'll take you through the gapping procedures for this and the torquing procedures for the rod, the head bolts, the head, side cover, and all the clearancing, etc. At this point in my build, every part has already been extremely cleaned and scrutinized. By the time you start assembly, everything should be immaculate. If you've cleaned it, clean it again. After you've cleaned everything, rub everything down with WD-40 and clean it a third time. By the time you're assembling the rod to the crankshaft, I use plastic gauge. There's a red and a green. I use the green one. That's from I think 1 to 3 thousandths. On the Bullfrog rod, the space between the rod bearing and crank should be anywhere from 2 to 3.5 thousandths. In my build, I'm putting it to 2 thousandths. So there's everything you should have should be in front of you, cleaned and ready for assembly. So let's go. Okay, so what we want to do next is assemble the rod onto the piston. So you take your rod and you take your piston. Make sure your rod and your piston are facing the right way, this end down, and on the rod, on this side, this has a threaded bolt hole on one side and the other, so the threaded bolt hole goes down. So you take your rod and your piston. This is a very simple step. Basically, everything that's going together, make sure it's clean, make sure it's oiled. So I've already oiled the rod. I've just oiled the pin, and now I'm oiling the piston. So now you just assemble everything together. Slip this in here. Slip that on like that. And then put in your wrist clips, wrist pin clips. These wrist pin clips are pretty small, so make sure they don't fly anywhere. And these are kind of something that you don't want to reuse. So if you are changing out a piston or something like that, it's probably best to just get some new wrist pins. This can be kind of tricky. And I know now it's going to give me a problem because I'm filming this. Okay. So our piston is on now. Now it's important to always check your end gap on your piston rings. The way you check an end gap on your ring is to insert the ring into the bore. You want to insert it an even amount down into the bore. And then after it's inserted into the bore, you get a feeler gauge. And you check how much clearance you have. So I have the piston ring installed, and I'm checking my clearance here, and it looks like it's 25 thousandths on the oil gap. On the oil ring gap, which is plenty. You know, for oil ring, the clearances don't have to be extremely tight. So having that at 25 thousandths, that's perfect. We just don't want them to bind. In this engine, we're using a total seal top ring, so nothing's getting past that. Next thing we want to do is put the piston rings on. Start with the oil ring and work your way up. So next ring I'm going to put in is the second ring. Good rule of thumb is if there's ever any writing on the ring, that end goes up. And I do have a ring installer, which basically just expands the rings. But I've found that you know, putting them on with your hands is just as easy. And then the last ring we're going to put on this piston is a total seal ring. This is a 2-part ring. And so this is the setup on the gapless ring. It's a 2-part ring, so this ring sits like this, and then it has a like an L groove cut into it, and then this ring sits on that ring. And like that, and fills the groove. So when it's in the piston, into that groove, there is no gap. It's completely filled by that split ring design, which is really nice. So before I install this, I just want to double check all my everything I have written down about this ring information so far, and then I'm going to move forward with that. While you're doing these installations or builds, especially if this isn't your first one, if this is your first one, always go through and check everything. If you're not sure about something, find an answer before you move forward. I've done this 1,000 times. I just want to double check on the way these rings go. But yeah, I'll be right back. Okay, so the way you want to set these up is the L-shaped ring. It goes on the top, and the groove on it faces down, so it goes on the top facing down. And I'm going to put this one at 12 o'clock. So you install the top ring first, and then you install the seal ring underneath that. And just like every other ring and sets of rings, you clock these as well. And just like that, it's installed. So that's how you install the rings on the piston. Okay, so next, after the rings are installed, we need to install the piston. Before installing the piston, make sure your cylinder bore is clean. Wipe that down real good. Before I install, what this is actually a piston ring compressor. You can get these Harbor Freight, you can get them online. Before I install the piston ring compressor, along with making sure that all your rings are on correctly, another thing you want to do, I like to put a little bit of oil on there. I don't like anything going down and through the bore that is not oiled. So when you're putting these ring compressors on, what you want to do is leave a little bit of the skirt still hanging out on the bottom. Let me get this tightened up a little bit and get it on, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So you want to get, when you tighten these on, you want to tighten these on as tight as you can tighten them. Really wrench down on them. So it's about as tight as I can get it. You want to leave these little, the end of the skirt sticking out of there, so that way you can get it down into the block. That'll help align it onto the block. Okay, once your piston's in the bore, you can start and get it onto the rod by rotating the crank around. Now you want to get it down into the bottom position, and then after it's down there, you can bolt on the rod end cap. Again, oil everything. I've oiled this already, but I'm going to oil it a little bit more. Get a little bit of oil on the journal with the bearing rods. Put some onto the bottom of the rod. Put that back on to the crank. And I like to position it down here at about 6 o'clock. That way I can get in, get my rod on, snug the rod on first with your hands. Make sure you press it on as tight as you can, and then work the nuts, the bolts rather, into the rod. This rod is a Bullfrog performance rod. It's different from the ARC rod. This rod has a different torque number that you set the bolts to. The ARC rod, I think you set them to 26. The torque specs on this rod are 30. There was no torquing procedure, but I don't like to just go straight to 30 on anything or straight to max torque on anything, so I'm going to step them up. I'll probably get them started at 20 pounds. So I'll set the torque wrench to 20 pounds. And I'll tighten them both on to the 20 pounds. So that's the top one. That's the bottom one to 20. And what I'm going to do, I've already torqued the rod down when I was checking my plastic gauge. So I've already ran it through. So I'm going to go 20, 24. I'm going to go 20, 24, 26, 28, 30. Okay, so I got all the bolts on the rod torqued down to 30 foot-pounds. Next is to install the cam. So in order to install the cam, there are a few things that go along with installing the cam. Installing the cam, you have to install the lifters into the lifter bore. You have to oil inside of the rear of the block. You have to oil the end of the rod, which I'll do now, the oiling. Oil the journal on the cam, the lobes. Don't be afraid to get a good amount of oil on there. And then let me put a little bit of oil in the back of here. Oh, another thing I didn't mention, the rod bolts. It's a really good thing to get some great, you know, like ARP, fastener assembly lubricant when you're torquing down bolts on a rod. That and head bolts are probably the two main bolts that you absolutely necessity have to have a good lube on. Don't try to use a cross-threaded or damaged head bolt, or a cross-threaded or damaged rod bolt, or a damaged rod thread, or anything like that. Those rod threads and the bolt threads and stuff like that, they have to be perfect so you can set the torque on those correctly. So after you get the cam lubed up and everything like that, we install the lifters and then we install the cam. Okay, so when I'm installing my lifters, what I like to do is I actually like to use a little bit of straight assembly lube on the lifter itself. Put the lifters up into the lifter bore. This helps them stick. And then I like to put a little bit right on the cam lobes as well. And then when you're installing your cam, you just find the marks on the crankshaft, rotate the crank around, and line the marks up. When you have the marks lined up, I'll show you the marks. When you have the marks lined up, that's correct. So if you see how it's on that one and the other one and they're lined up correctly, when they're lined up, you'll know it. So when it's lined up like that, that's when you push the cam in. You know, sometimes people will say, oh, well, do you line it up when it's pushed in or when it's pulled out? Because the teeth on the cam are actually ground at an angle. So it does look different. If you look now, it almost looks like they're not lined up. But if you pull the cam out to where they're level, you can tell they're lined up. But when you push the cam in, so that's why you want to make sure it's lined up when the cam is flush with this gear here. When these are flush, that's when you line it up. So now that the lifters are in and the cam is in, we can go ahead and put our crank shim on. And we could put our camshaft shims on. And after our shims are in, we can go ahead and we can close the block. We can bolt on the side cover. Another thing I didn't mention, I've probably mentioned it in other videos, make sure you clearance the cam, the crank, the block. Make sure there's nothing's gonna hit. So when you're at a stage like this, you want to make sure you can rotate everything around and that nothing hits. So you want to be able to just keep on rotating this engine around and having nothing hit. If you can rotate the engine around and nothing hits, you've done a good job. And then you slide the side cover on. Instead of just putting it on, I like to kind of align my gasket with the bolts. Because just like this, sometimes the gasket can get a little out of place. And then you go around and you get all your side cover bolts installed. Okay, once you have them all tightened up, you can go ahead and torque these bolts down to 17 foot-pounds. That's 10, 15, 17, and this is a 10mm socket. So I'm not going to make you guys watch all this. I'll go ahead and do this and I'll come back to you after I'm done. Okay, so now that the side cover's on, your bottom end of your block is all assembled. Next is the head and head gasket and torquing that on. I'll make another video on that because I want to go into some real depth on that. So hope you guys liked it and hope that was helpful.